Welcome back. Well, the role played by non-residents in Canada's housing market is often debated, but how many of those non-residents own more than one home? Here's a look by the numbers. About 3.5% of homeowners in Canada are non-resident owners, according to StatsCan's Canadian Housing Statistics Program. That is 340,735 homes owned by people who don't live here and who pay taxes elsewhere. But what's striking is the number of those who own multiple homes. 10.2% own at least one other home in the same region. The percentages are higher in the eastern provinces, with Nova Scotia leading the way at almost 14% of non-resident owners owning more than one property. Ontario has the highest number of non-resident property owners at 187,325, and more than 19,000 of them own multiple properties. The role of non-resident owners is debated, but it does seem impossible that there could be no effect on the demand side of the equation in real estate, especially if those owners are less price sensitive. Murtaza Haider is a professor of real estate management at Toronto Metropolitan University. Great to have you with us, Murtaza.
Thank you.
So this is often debated, and of course, people shrink from wanting to appear to be in any way sort of opposed to foreign ownership, and even the word foreign, of course, carries wrong connotations. Some of these may be Canadians who are domiciled elsewhere, who have vacation properties here. But what role do you think these kind of multiple home owners might play when they don't live here, but they do own property?
I think the impact of their ownership on pricing is minimal at best. They're not large enough to force price movements. What happens is that in some instances, some markets, for example, Whistler in British Columbia, you would see a significant portion of dwellings are owned by foreigners, and they're mostly Americans who have their winter homes for skiing seasons there. And there are some other pockets like these across Canada. So in some very local markets, there may be some impact. There have been studies done more so in British Columbia than elsewhere, where foreign home owners they've tried to quantify the impact of foreign home ownership. And even in recent studies, that impact has been very small. So yes, it may seem like a concern to many, but given these small numbers, and notice that you're talking about foreign home owners, not home buyers. Right. So there are millions of homes in Canada, and of those, about a few, 300,000, you said, are owned by foreigners. That's not a very large number to push the prices in a certain direction.
Is there actually a silver lining to this, in the sense, Murtaza, that many of these are likely to be rented out? We presume they may be Airbnb, they may be rental properties, long-term rental properties. In other words, they might fill gaps in our market because they're investments for other players, but that they still represent places that we can access as housing.
So I can only wager a guess here, because the data are silent on this as to what percentage of the foreign-owned homes are available in the rental market. But I wouldn't assume that to be a much larger percentage of those. Maybe these are vacation homes. And I think that when Canadians think about foreign home ownership in Canada, they should also think about Canadians who own homes elsewhere. For example, a very large segment of senior Canadians have their homes in places like Florida and elsewhere in the United States. So if we try to restrict or create barriers to foreign home ownership in Canada, that would be most likely be reciprocated by others, and would make us difficult for us to purchase homes elsewhere. So it's a two-way street. We have to be careful.
Yeah, fair enough.
When we apply them.
Only a couple of seconds here, but the fact that 10% of them that own more than one in the same market, again, that's going to be a small number, because it's a 10% of what you would say is already a small number. But would that be in a special category? Should we actually look more closely at that and say those are investments, not residents?
Yes. So, for example, there's no need for someone to own two homes in the same market. Let's say a foreign homeowner who has multiple homes in Toronto and Vancouver. Most likely in those circumstances, those are investment properties that are available in the rental market. So you remember that we have a very big shortage of rental supply. And if there is a way to get more rental supply, and it happens to be foreign homeowners, then that'd be the case.
Great to have you, Murtaza. Always appreciate it.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Murtaza Haider is a professor of real estate management at Toronto Metropolitan University. Well, one big factor for housing affordability and supply in Canada is, and has been for some time, immigration. Canada has lofty targets when it comes to new Canadians, but targets aside, we have a record number of would-be immigrants stuck in a bureaucratic backlog, some 2.6 million applicants caught in limbo, waiting to be processed. Karim El Assal is managing director of CIC News. Great to have you with us, Karim.
Great to be here, Amanda. Thank you for having me.
So those who are skeptical, I'm tying this to housing because people who are skeptical about whether the housing market will stay strong will say simple supply and demand tells you household formation will support strong housing prices. And we know there are millions of people who are waiting to be processed as new Canadians. Give me the context on this of how serious it is that we're at that level, more than 2.5 million people, and we're not able to get through that backlog.
Yeah, it is a serious issue that's having huge ramifications economically and socially. On the economic side, we're obviously dealing with significant worker shortages, and that's largely a function of our inability to bring in workers from overseas quickly enough. On the social side, families are being kept apart, and of course refugees and displaced persons are not being able to come into Canada in a timely manner so that they can restart their lives.
Do we have a sense of what the problem is, of why there is this kind of, we know that it's happening with passports and elsewhere in the system, but why with immigration, where there's been such a focus by this government in particular on upping our targets and bringing as many people as possible?
The backlog is largely a function of two issues. First, there are legitimate reasons associated with the pandemic itself. Namely, at the start of the pandemic, Canadian government officials understandably had to shelter in place for their health and safety. At the same time, there have been policy missteps taken by the government which have exacerbated the situation. So unfortunately, due to a mix of the two factors, we have seen the backlog grow, like you said, Amanda, to well over 2 million people, and it has nearly tripled since the start of the pandemic.
Now, on the plus side, Karim, we're still attractive to people from around the world who want to come here. We just recently, of course, topping out on lists for livability and stability. That's the good news. Does this backlog put people off? Are we at risk of losing potential new Canadians because they know there's a waiting period?
Well, I mean, Canada lives in a global village. Our immigration system isn't isolated. Obviously, when people look to move to Canada, they're also comparing us against countries like the United States and the UK and Australia, New Zealand, and others. At the same time, the surveys conducted during the pandemic indicate that demands to come to Canada remains very strong. And the key reason for this is that in the surveys, the prospective newcomers indicate they view Canada's economic prospects post-pandemic to be far brighter than what they expect in their source countries. So in spite of all the challenges, it seems like demands to come to Canada remains very strong. And even putting analysis aside, I mean, we can just look at the numbers. The fact that we have an inventory, a backlog of over 2 million people, tells us, as a matter of fact, that there remains very strong demands to come here.
Karim, great to have you with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Amanda. Take care.
Karim El Assal is managing editor at CIC News. Coming up, how extreme weather events might make our lives more expensive. But first, this. If you were hoping to swipe right in the metaverse, you'll have to wait a while. And if that whole sentence is nonsense to you, you're not alone. The dating app Tinder had launched in the virtual platform created by what used to be called Facebook, but it turns out there isn't as much dating happening as Tinder thought. The real story is what that means for the hugely hyped metaverse, since this category of product usually leads the way in new technology, not just the oldest but the most lucrative of professions. We're back after this.